What's the difference between the International Development Secretary and the Foreign Secretary?
Some people say that all of development ought to be part of the Foreign Office. Well, we separate it because we think there's a very distinct purpose in development. We're trying to take a long-term view to help countries come out of poverty, build their economies, build good government, and then be able to look after themselves. That can perhaps sometimes help work better if people don't think that the country who's spending the money is trying to push its own, national agenda. And so the Foreign Office is much more diplomacy. It's dealing with foreign ministers, it's dealing with all of the world's foreign problems. We're dealing with a more specific part of dealing with other countries, which is helping lift them out of poverty. So we are trying to make sure that, if you're a mother and you're giving birth to a child, you don't die. And if you're a little baby, you don't die within 5 years, which in some poor countries they do. We're doing things like inoculating people so they don't get TB or polio or things like that. So we've got some specific programs in a few targeted countries. The Foreign Office has to look after the whole world. And of course a lot of the stuff they're doing is European, and we don't need to spend money on European countries because they're rich enough. So they are separate, but we work very, very closely together.
Why do we spend money on other countries when we have huge money problems in the UK and we are having to make cuts like closing libraries?
In general terms, we're a very rich country. What you're seeing at the moment, though, is that we're going through a bad period because the country really didn't handle its money very well. And bankers made a mess of it, the government spent too much money, and then when things got quieter, there was less tax coming in, interest rates went up, they couldn't afford it. So we've got a financial squeeze in the country. Our view is we're still relatively rich, and we shouldn't suddenly pull the rug from underneath the poorest people in the world and make them suffer even more just because we've made a mess of our own country, a temporary mess. Yeah. So what we're saying is it's for us to ride the ups and downs of our own problems, but we should keep our help to the poorest countries in the world steady and constant. So we've got a phrase we use, is that we don't want to punish the world's poorest people just because we made a mess of ourselves. So that's why we're actually the first country in the world to promise to spend 0.7% of our national income on the world's poorest, and we're going to pass a law to make sure it's going to happen. And so I'm quite proud of the fact that we're doing what we're doing. We're only spending about 0.5% of everything at the moment on the world's poor. And if you had 100 quid, would you give 50p to the beggar in the street? Yeah, you probably would. But that's what we're doing. But we're trying to make sure that they're not always beggars. We're trying to make sure that they can rise from being dependent on aid so they can stand on their own 2 feet. That's why we call it development and not aid. We used to call it overseas aid. Here's some money, get on with it. No. Now it's international development, which means we're going to help you be able to stand on your own 2 feet. That's the plan. And it's worked in some countries like Vietnam. Vietnam used to be at war. 30 years later, they're getting richer.
What do you think events in Libya and other countries in that region mean for the future of the world, and should we interfere?
The first thing I say is that we're living in a very dangerous world, because instability is always dangerous. And oil does matter, because if the oil price were to double, it would hurt everybody. The other thing I'd say is that all countries are different. What you've got throughout the whole Arab world is a sudden explosion of population. So 50% of all these countries are under the age of perhaps 20. And so you've got this massive sort of population wave coming up where governments can't give them jobs, and they're finding it very difficult to make them feel that they're being paid enough. And so there's an explosion of anger, and that's really what the main anger is. It's jobs. It's also they feel their government isn't delivering and that it's not democratic. So in a country like Egypt, they had someone who was there for 30 years, and Gaddafi's been there for 40 years, and no one really elected him. So they're saying, oh wait, we want a proper government. In the case of Gaddafi, he's a very, very bad man who is capable of gassing or shooting his own people. Most of the other countries don't want to do that. That's why Libya is probably, top of the list, because it's the worst. In Egypt, yes, they want to step towards democracy, but it can't just happen like that. What do we have here as part of democracy? We've got rules, we've got political parties, we've got an election system which people trust. They trust the result. If we have an election result, people know it's an honest result. You've got to have all these things to make a country work, and you can't just do it like that. So in Egypt, they're trying to do it by September. In Tunisia, they've got to work out what the rules are. They'll probably have a presidential election. In Libya, it's just a complete mess, because you've had a dictatorship for 40 years. Now, in the Arab countries of the Arabian Gulf, like Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia, they're all different, but they've all got monarchies, kingdoms, and they're gradually moving towards a more accountable system of government. Thing is, if they were to let go immediately, they might find it's replaced by someone like Gaddafi. That's what happened in Iran in 1979. The Shah went, everyone said, oh, we don't like the Shah because he dresses up in uniform and he looks like a king and he's horrible, but we haven't had a very good alternative for 30 years, so you've got to work out what's going to replace them. So in the Arab countries like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, they are moving, and we've got to encourage them to move, but we must make sure that it doesn't all collapse into chaos. So all of these countries are different. Does that make sense?
Who chooses which countries to help? Are we helping Japan, and how is it decided?
There are two questions in there, really. When you mention Japan, you're really thinking about disaster relief. In the first part of your question, what you're really thinking about more is which poor countries do we pick to help. Now, in terms of disaster, we'll help anybody, but obviously Japan is far better equipped to cope with its own problems than a country like Pakistan. So we're obviously going to concentrate much more on those poor countries with a weak government and no resources to cope with a disaster. And let me give you an example. Last week I was in Nepal. Nepal is next door to India. It's a poor country, and the capital of Nepal is called Kathmandu, and it had a massive earthquake in 1934. All the experts say, well, it should probably have had another one by now, and it hasn't. So there's a big danger that there will be an earthquake in Kathmandu, and there's been lots of building. In 1934 there were probably 500,000 people there. Now there are 5 million. So if there's an earthquake, you could have the most awful disaster, and it's surrounded by mountains. So if the airport's cut off, no one can get to it. It could be awful. So one of the things I was doing is saying we've really got to make serious plans in case this disaster happens. So that's an example of where we think that it's both poor and it's dangerous. In terms of which countries we focus in, we've just had a complete review in the department of all the countries we work in and all the organisations we work with, like the United Nations and the World Bank. And we've tried to work out not just how much money we put in, but what we get out the other end. So if I'm putting £1 million into a programme, I want to know how many lives it saves, or how many children get inoculated against disease, or things like that. I want to see results. So we've assessed all our programmes for value for money, for results, and what we get out the other end. Because your first question, your question, which was, why are we doing this when we've got difficulty at home?
Yeah.
We have to make sure, particularly because of that issue, that every penny we spend gets the full value, that it's not wasted, that someone doesn't steal it, and all that kind of stuff. And that's why we've had all these reviews, and so we've chopped off 16 countries, some of which will still get our help, but through the United Nations or something like that. So we've reduced the number we deal directly with. We're increasing in Bangladesh, we're increasing in Nepal, we're increasing in Pakistan, we're increasing in Palestine, but we're cutting some others. So we've got a value for money focus to make sure that the taxpayer can't turn around and say that we're wasting their money. So, and poverty is the thing. We want to lift countries out of poverty. And there are 8 useful measures of this called the Millennium Development Goals, which are making sure people get fed, making sure people get educated, making sure they don't die in childbirth or as a young baby, all of that kind of stuff. So, and we think it's very important to empower women and girls, because if girls get educated, normally the boys go to school and often the girls don't. We want the girls in school too, because then they don't become teenage mothers. They're educated, they can help the family, they become the the sort of whole energy behind improving everyone's lives. So that's how we decide.